The metal gate slams shut with a hollow, echoing bang. Inside the dim shelter, the sound of frightened whimpers fills the air. Small, desperate, fading. A row of trembling pups huddles together in the corner, their eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. No tags, no names, no one coming. "Time's up," the official says coldly, barely glancing at them as he signs a clipboard. His voice is calm, practiced, like this is routine. A worker hesitates. "Sir, just a few more hours. Maybe someone—" "No one's coming." He cuts in, sharp and final. Boots scrape against the concrete as he steps forward. And then, "Stop." The voice is steady, clear, unshaken. Every head in the room turns. A woman stands at the entrance, her expression unreadable, but her eyes locked on the pups. "I'll take them," she says. Silence. Not relief. Not gratitude. Something else. The official slowly lowers his clipboard, studying her like she just made a mistake she doesn't understand. "All of them?" he asks. She nods once, and that's when the room changes. A glance between staff. A subtle shift. Unease creeping in where hope should be, because somehow this wasn't a rescue. It felt like a disruption, like she just stepped into something she wasn't supposed to see. Now pause for a second. Be honest. If you were standing there, knowing you might be stepping into something dangerous, would you still take them? And before we go further, if you love stories like this, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, because what happens next? No one in that room was ready for it. She didn't move immediately after she said it. That was the first thing that felt off about her. Most people, when they make a bold declaration, especially one that involves saving lives, rush forward, fueled by adrenaline or emotion. But she didn't. She stood still, letting the weight of her words settle into the room like dust after something collapses. Her posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed for someone who had just volunteered to take responsibility for a group of animals no one else wanted. Her eyes, though, that's where the tension lived. Sharp, calculating, observing everything. The official watched her for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if trying to decide whether she was serious or just another impulsive do-gooder who didn't understand what she was getting into. "That's not how this works," he said finally, his tone controlled but edged with something colder underneath. "These animals aren't listed for standard adoption." "I didn't ask how it works," she replied, her voice still calm, almost disarmingly so. "I said I'll take them." A few of the staff exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger woman with tired eyes, looked like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. Another worker subtly shook his head, a warning disguised as a reflex. The room was communicating something without words, and she was picking up every signal. "Name?" the official asked. She hesitated just long enough to be noticeable, but not suspicious. "Elena." It wasn't a lie. Not entirely, but it wasn't the name that mattered. He scribbled something down, then looked back up at her. "You understand what you're agreeing to? Medical costs, liability, or behavioral risks. These aren't typical cases." "I understand," she said. But what she understood went far beyond what he was implying. Because she had been watching this place for weeks. From the outside, the shelter looked like any other underfunded facility. Peeling paint, overcrowded cages, overworked staff. The kind of place people felt bad about but rarely did anything to help. Donations came and went. Volunteers rotated in and out. Nothing about it stood out, except the patterns. Dogs brought in without records. Animals that were never listed online. Night deliveries that didn't match intake logs. And the strangest part, the ones that were never claimed didn't behave like abandoned strays. They were too alert, too responsive. as if they had been trained or conditioned. That's what caught her attention. And once it did, she couldn't ignore it. She wasn't there by accident. She wasn't there because she loved animals, although she did. She wasn't there because she couldn't stand the idea of those pups being put down, although that part was real too. She was there because something about this place didn't add up, and she had made it her job to find out why. The pups in the corner shifted as she stepped closer, their small bodies pressing together instinctively. Fear was expected, but what she noticed instead was recognition. Not of her, but of intention. They weren't just scared of the environment, they were assessing her. That confirmed it. One of them, a small brown pup with a faint marking near its eye, didn't retreat like the others. It held her gaze for a moment longer than any animal that age should. Not aggressive, not submissive, aware. She crouched down slowly, careful not to startle them. "Hey," she murmured softly, her tone completely different now. Gentler, but still deliberate. The brown pup tilted its head slightly. Behind her, the official cleared his throat. "We'll need paperwork signed, immediate transfer, no delays." "Of course," she said, standing up again. Too easy. That was the second thing that didn't sit right. If this was just about liability, they would push back harder, ask more questions, delay the process. But instead, they were rushing her through it, almost like they wanted the pups gone, or wanted her gone with them. She followed one of the staff members to a small office, the fluorescent light flickering faintly above. The desk was cluttered with files, some neatly stacked, others shoved aside like they didn't matter. As the workers shuffled papers around, Elena let her gaze wander just enough to take everything in without making it obvious. Folders labeled with dates that didn't match intake records, a locked drawer with scratch marks near the handle, a security monitor in the corner, showing multiple camera feeds, but 2 of them were blacked out. "Sign here," the worker said quietly, sliding a form toward her. Elena glanced down, but her attention was split. "Busy place?" she said casually. The woman gave a short, humorless laugh. "You could say that. You get a lot of unusual cases?" The worker paused for a fraction of a second. Then, "We get what we're sent." That answer told her everything and nothing at the same time. "Who sends them?" Elena asked, still keeping her tone light. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "If you're smart, you won't ask questions like that." Elena met her eyes. There was fear there. Not exaggerated. Not performative. Real. Before she could press further, the door opened abruptly. The official stepped in. "Everything in order?" "Yes," the worker said quickly, stepping back. He didn't take his eyes off Elena. "You'll be transporting them yourself?" "Yes." "No assistance?" "I prefer it that way." Another pause. Another calculation. Then he nodded. "Very well." But the way he said it wasn't approval. It was permission. And that distinction mattered. Minutes later, the pups were being loaded into transport crates. They didn't resist as much as expected. In fact, they moved with an eerie kind of coordination, as if they had done this before. As if they knew the routine. Elena noticed everything. The way the staff avoided eye contact during the process, the way one of them subtly slipped something into one of the crates. A small object, barely visible. The way the security cameras seemed to track her movement just a little too closely. She didn't react. Not yet. Because this was the part where most people would make a mistake. They would confront, question, try to force answers, but she knew better. You don't expose something like this by pushing from the outside. You let it unfold. You step inside it. And then you find the cracks. As she secured the final crate, the brown pup looked up at her again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Trust, not complete, Not blind, but enough. Don't worry, she whispered under her breath. I've got you. Whether she was talking to the pup or herself was unclear. The official stood near the exit, watching her every move. Once you leave, he said, there's no returning them. She met his gaze. That won't be a problem. Something flickered in his expression. Interest? Amusement? It was hard to tell. Good, he said. But as she pushed the cart toward the door, she could feel it. The shift. The moment where she stopped being just another person walking in and became someone they needed to watch. Outside, the air felt different. Cooler. Quieter. But not safer. She loaded the crates into her vehicle with practiced efficiency, double-checking each latch, each lock. Her movements were precise, controlled. Not rushed, not hesitant. When she finally closed the back door, she didn't get in right away. Instead, she stood there for a second, looking back at the building. From the outside, it still looked ordinary. That was the problem. Because now she knew it wasn't. And whatever was happening inside wasn't going to stay contained for long. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, no bigger than a key fob. With a subtle press, a faint light blinked once. Active. Everything from this point on would be recorded. Every interaction, every movement, every mistake they made. She slipped it back into her pocket, then got into the driver's seat. As the engine started, one thought settled in her mind with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about saving a few abandoned pups. This was about uncovering something that had been hidden in plain sight. And now that she had stepped in, there was no stepping out. Not until she knew the truth. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from what Elena saw. It came from what didn't happen. No calls, no follow-up, no verification checks. For an adoption that large, especially involving animals flagged as non-standard, there should have been layers of oversight. At the very least, a delayed confirmation, a supervisor reaching out, a paper trail tightening around her movements. But instead, there was silence. Clean. Intentional. The kind of silence that isn't an absence of attention, but the result of something being deliberately suppressed. That was when she understood the third thing that didn't sit right. They weren't trying to track her through official channels. They were watching her in ways that wouldn't leave evidence. The realization settled in slowly as she drove, eyed the road stretching ahead under the fading light. She didn't look in the rearview mirror too often. That would be a mistake. Anyone trained to monitor behavior looks for patterns, and paranoia leaves patterns. Instead, she let her awareness widen, catching reflections in storefront glass. The rhythm of passing headlights, the subtle presence of a vehicle that stayed just a fraction too consistent behind her before turning off at the next intersection. If someone was following her, they were good, but not invisible. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, dusk had deepened into something heavier, the kind of early night that swallows detail and replaces it with suggestion. Her destination wasn't her real one. It never was. And the address she had given on the forms, a modest property on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, was a placeholder, a decoy. She slowed as she approached it, signaling like any ordinary driver, turning into the narrow driveway with just enough hesitation to appear natural. The house itself was dark, unoccupied, maintained just enough to avoid suspicion. She parked, turned off the engine, and waited. Not moving, not reaching for anything, just listening. The pups in the back were quiet now. Too quiet. That same unnatural stillness she had noticed at the shelter had followed them here. It wasn't fear that kept them silent. It was anticipation. That confirmed what she had suspected. Whatever they had been through, it had trained them not just to react, but to observe. Minutes passed. No headlights slowed, no doors opened, No footsteps approached. If someone had been following her, they either chose not to reveal themselves, or they didn't need to. She exhaled slowly, then reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a second device, smaller than the first, with a thin wire attached. Without turning on the interior light, she leaned forward and slid it beneath the dashboard, securing it in place with practiced precision. A signal interceptor. If anything in or around the vehicle attempted to transmit data, she'd know. When she stepped out of the car, the air felt colder than it should have. Not in temperature, but in presence. The kind of subtle shift that tells you you're not as alone as you appear. She moved to the back, opening the door carefully. The pups blinked up at her, their eyes catching what little light remained, and the brown one was still watching her the same way, focused, aware, almost as if it understood more than it should. "We're not staying here," she murmured softly, just loud enough for them. It wasn't reassurance, it was a promise. She unloaded them quickly but without rushing, carrying each crate into the house. The interior was sparse, just enough furniture to make it believable, nothing personal, nothing traceable. She set the crates down in the main room, then closed and locked the door behind her. For a moment, everything was still. Then she moved. Fast. Efficient. The transformation of the space took less than 3 minutes. A panel in the floor slid open, revealing a concealed lower level. Not large, but secure. Reinforced walls, soundproofing, independent power. She began transferring the pups downstairs one by one, her movements fluid, practiced. This was the real destination, the real safe point. Once the last crate was secured below, she sealed the panel and reset the room above, leaving no visible sign that anything had changed. Then she waited again. This time, longer. Watching. Listening. Counting the seconds between distant sounds, mapping the environment in her head. And then, there it was. Not a knock. Not a forced entry. A signal. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. A faint shift in the air, followed by a soft click from somewhere outside the house. Elena didn't move immediately. She didn't react at all. Because this wasn't about what she did next. It was about what they expected her to do. If she checked the door, they would know she had noticed. If she ignored it completely, they might escalate. So she chose something in between. She walked casually toward the kitchen, turning on a dim light, pouring herself a glass of water like nothing had changed. But her attention was fully focused on the edges of the room, the windows, the faint reflections that could betray movement outside. Seconds passed. Then a shadow shifted where there shouldn't have been one. Someone was there, not trying to get in, just confirming, observing, measuring her response. The opposing force had made its first move, not with aggression, but with presence. A message without words. "We see you." Elena took a slow sip of water, then set the glass down with deliberate calm. "Good," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That saves me time." Because now she knew for certain. This wasn't just a hidden operation. It was an organized one, structured, disciplined, and most importantly, it was aware of her. That changed the rules. This was no longer a quiet investigation. It was an active engagement. And in engagements like this, hesitation gets you exposed. She turned off the light and moved back into the main room, her steps silent against the floor. From a small case tucked beneath the couch, she retrieved a compact tablet, activating it with a quick swipe. Multiple feeds came online instantly, signals pulled from the device in her car, the interceptor beneath the dashboard, and a secondary sensor she had placed near the property days earlier. One of the feeds flickered. A brief spike. External interference. Someone had scanned the vehicle. Not thoroughly, but enough to check for something obvious. They were being careful. That meant they didn't know exactly what she was. Not yet. which meant she still had the advantage, but not for long. Downstairs, one of the pups let out a soft sound. Not a whimper, not quite a bark. Something in between. Elena paused, listening. Then she realized it wasn't distress. It was a response to something outside. The brown pup again, always the first to react. She crouched near the floor panel, her voice low. "What do you hear?" The pup didn't answer, of course, but it shifted, positioning itself closer to the direction of the front of the house. Tracking. That was when it clicked into place fully. These weren't just animals caught in something unusual. They were part of it. Not willingly, not knowingly, but intentionally. Trained to detect, to respond, possibly even to signal, which meant the people behind this weren't just hiding operations. They were developing tools, living ones. The implication sent a cold, it controlled anger through her chest, not explosive, not reckless, but focused. Because now the mission wasn't just about exposure, it was about prevention. Whatever this was, it was still in progress. And that meant there was still time to stop it. But first, she needed to understand the structure, the chain of command, the weak points. And to do that, she would need to push further than observation. She would need to provoke a response, carefully, precisely. Just enough to make them react, but not enough to reveal her full hand. Her gaze shifted back to the tablet. Another signal spike. This one closer. Not from the car, from the perimeter. They were still there, watching, waiting, not leaving until they were satisfied. Elena stood slowly, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "All right," she said under her breath. "Let's see how patient you are." Because rising tension isn't just about pressure from one side. It's about the moment both sides realize they're not dealing with something ordinary. And that moment had just arrived. The opposing force had stepped into the game, and Elena had no intention of playing defensively. By the next morning, Elena had already decided something that would have sounded reckless to anyone on the outside. She was going back, not sneaking in, not circling from a distance, walking straight through the front door again. This time, not as an outsider disrupting their process, but as someone they had already seen, already measured, and not yet fully understood. That uncertainty was her leverage. In operations like this, familiarity is often mistaken for safety, and she intended to use that blind spot as long as it lasted. She adjusted her appearance just enough to appear slightly different, hair tied back instead of loose, a simple jacket replacing the one from the night before. Posture relaxed in a way that suggested nothing more than routine follow-up. People remember energy more than details, and she knew how to control both. When she stepped into the shelter, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, though subtle. Conversations didn't stop, but they slowed. Glances lingered a fraction longer. One of the staff members at the front desk blinked in surprise before quickly masking it with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're back," she said, tone carefully neutral. "I forgot something," Elena replied easily, stepping closer to the counter without hesitation. "Paperwork. And I had a couple of questions about care routines." The lie was simple, almost boring. That was the point. Suspicion thrives on complexity, and she was giving them nothing to latch onto. At least, not yet. The woman nodded slowly, tapping something into the computer. "Of course, the director is available. He'll want to speak with you." There it was. Not a suggestion, a direction. Elena gave a small, agreeable nod as if this was expected. That makes sense. As she was led through the hallway, she let her attention drift, not obviously scanning, but absorbing everything. The building felt different during the day, brighter, more open. But the tension was still there, woven beneath the surface like a second structure layered over the visible one. Doors that had been closed the previous night were now slightly ajar. A faint chemical scent lingered in the air, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And the security cameras. She counted at least 3 new angles that hadn't been active before. They were adapting. Fast. That meant she had less time than she initially thought. The director's office was larger than it needed to be, which in itself said something. Space is a form of power, and he was using it deliberately. He sat behind his desk when she entered, posture composed, expression calm in a way that could almost pass for welcoming if you didn't look too closely. "Ms. Elena," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." "I like to be thorough," she replied, taking the seat without waiting to be told twice, especially when responsibility is involved. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing the sincerity of that statement. "That's admirable," he said finally. "Not common, but admirable." The conversation that followed was, on the surface, completely ordinary. Care instructions, feeding schedules, behavioral recommendations, but beneath every word there was something else moving, something quieter, sharper. He wasn't just answering her questions. He was studying how she asked them, measuring what she already knew against what she pretended not to. And she was doing the same to him. It was a social exchange, but not a casual one. It was controlled, strategic. Each sentence placed with intention, each pause carrying more weight than the words themselves. At one point he leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "You took on quite a burden," he said. "Most people wouldn't." "Most people didn't," she replied. "That's why I did." A faint smile touched his lips, what though it didn't reach his eyes. "And yet, you came back? That suggests curiosity. Or responsibility?" she countered smoothly. "Sometimes they look the same." That earned a slightly longer pause, not discomfort, consideration. Then he nodded, as if acknowledging a move well played. "Perhaps they do." There was a knock at the door, soft, controlled. One of the staff members stepped in, carrying a tray with coffee and a few small plates. "For the meeting," she said, placing them carefully on the desk. Elena recognized her immediately, the same worker who had warned her subtly the night before. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment something passed between them. Not a message. Not exactly. More like confirmation. The woman set the tray down and stepped back, but instead of leaving immediately, she hesitated. Just slightly. Enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. The director didn't look at her, but his voice shifted. Just enough to carry authority without raising volume. "That will be all." "Yes, sir," she said and left quickly. Elena picked up the coffee, taking a slow sip. Not because she wanted it, but because it gave her a moment to think without speaking. The liquid was warm, slightly bitter. Normal. But the placement of the tray had been deliberate. Too deliberate. When the director's attention shifted momentarily to a document on his desk, she adjusted the plate in front of her by less than an inch. Beneath it, partially concealed, was a small folded piece of paper. She didn't react. Not outwardly. That would have been the mistake. Instead, she continued the conversation as if nothing had changed. Her tone steady, her posture relaxed. But her mind was already moving ahead, mapping possibilities, calculating risks. The meeting ended 10 minutes later, with no clear resolution and no overt conflict. Just a polite exchange that felt far more significant than it appeared. As she stood to leave, the director watched her again, that same unreadable expression settling over his features. "If you have further questions," he said, "you're welcome to return." The phrasing was intentional. Not "contact us," not "call ahead." Return. As if he expected it. As if he wanted it. Elena gave a small nod. I'll keep that in mind. She left the office at a normal pace, neither rushing nor lingering. The hallway felt longer on the way out, though nothing had physically changed. When she reached the main room, she paused near the exit, not enough to draw attention, just enough to adjust her bag. In that motion, her fingers slipped beneath the plate, retrieving the folded paper and sliding it into her sleeve in one smooth, practiced movement. No one reacted. Or if they did, they didn't show it. Outside, the air felt sharper than before, clearer, as if the building itself had been holding something in. She walked to her car without looking back, maintaining the same steady rhythm she had used on the way in. Only when she was inside, doors locked, engine off, did she allow herself to unfold the paper. The message was short, handwritten, rushed. Basement, East Wing, midnight. Cameras cycle every 90 seconds. Don't trust him. No signature, no explanation. But it didn't need one. It was enough. More than enough. And because it confirmed everything she had suspected, and introduced something new, an opening, but also a trap, potentially. Information like this doesn't appear without a cost. Either the person who left it was taking a significant risk, or they were being used to draw her deeper. Elena leaned back in the seat, the paper still in her hand, her eyes unfocused for a moment as she processed the implications. Basement, East Wing. That matched the blind spots she had noticed on the security feeds. Areas intentionally left unmonitored, or at least appearing that way. Midnight, a time chosen for a reason, fewer staff, less activity, but also fewer witnesses. Cameras cycling every 90 seconds. That wasn't just a detail, it was an invitation, a window. Don't trust him. That narrowed the field, but not enough. It could refer to the director. It could refer to someone else entirely. In operations like this, trust isn't a given. It's a variable. And variables are what get people caught. She folded the paper again, more carefully this time, and slipped it into a secure compartment in her jacket. Her next move would define everything that followed. Go in, and she risked walking into a controlled environment designed to expose her. Stay out, and she lost the chance to access whatever they were hiding below the surface. But the decision wasn't as difficult as it might seem. Because this wasn't just about risk anymore. It was about confirmation, the social scene, the conversation, the subtle exchanges, the carefully placed message had shifted the narrative. What had been suspicion was now direction. What had been observation was now action. And somewhere beneath that building, and in a part of it most people would never see, was the truth. Elena started the engine, her expression settling back into that same calm, controlled focus. Midnight wasn't far, and neither was the next step. Midnight didn't arrive with drama. It never does. It slips in quietly, unnoticed by most, which is exactly why operations like this prefer it. By 11:47 p.m., Elena was already in position, parked 3 blocks away from the shelter with the engine off and the interior lights disabled. She sat still, not out of hesitation, but control. Every movement from this point forward had to be deliberate. The paper sat folded in her palm again, not because she needed to reread it, but because repetition sharpens instinct. Basement, East Wing, midnight. Cameras cycle every 90 seconds. Don't trust him. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a test. Whoever had written it wanted to see how she would respond, whether she would walk in blindly or adapt. Elena didn't do blind. At 11:52, she stepped out of the vehicle, locking it with a manual click instead of the remote. Small detail, less signal, less trace. She moved through the side streets with quiet efficiency, keeping to shadows not out of fear, but out of habit. By the time she reached the outer perimeter of the shelter, her breathing hadn't changed, Her pace hadn't faltered, but her awareness had expanded, stretching across every angle, every possible line of sight. The building looked different at night again, not darker, emptier, as if whatever life it held during the day had been pulled inward, leaving only structure behind. She circled once, slow, casual, mapping the exterior again. One light in the west wing, none in the east. That matched the note. No visible guards, no movement, too clean. That was the fourth thing that didn't sit right. Places like this don't leave their most sensitive areas unguarded. Unless they don't need to. Or unless the guard is something less obvious. She reached the side entrance she had identified earlier, a service door with an outdated lock and a camera positioned just above it. She didn't avoid the camera. That would trigger suspicion. Instead, she timed her movement with the cycle she had observed earlier in the day. 90 seconds wasn't long, but it was enough. When the camera shifted, even slightly, she moved. Quick. Precise. The lock gave way with minimal resistance, and she slipped inside without a sound. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the kind of lighting that creates more shadow than clarity. She paused just inside the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just the faint hum of the building itself. She moved toward the east wing, counting her steps, tracking the rhythm of the cameras above. 1 cycle. 2. She stayed just outside their arcs, not rushing, not hesitating. The entrance to the basement wasn't hidden, but it wasn't obvious either. A reinforced door at the end of a narrow corridor, marked only with a small faded sign that read, "Storage." She stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning the frame, the hinges, the floor beneath it. No visible alarms, no secondary locks. That wasn't reassuring. It was suspicious. She reached for the handle and paused. Not because she was unsure, because something in her instinct pushed back. The message had been too convenient, too precise. Cameras cycle every 90 seconds. And that kind of information isn't passed casually. It's either given by someone desperate or someone setting a stage. And then it clicked. Not the lock, the pattern, the timing. The way everything had aligned just a little too perfectly. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a controlled opening, a funnel. She wasn't the only one following a plan. The realization didn't stop her. It adjusted her. She didn't pull her hand back. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, angling her body just enough to reduce exposure. Then she opened the door. The stairwell beyond was narrow, descending into deeper shadow with each step. The air was cooler here, heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent that didn't belong in a storage area. She moved down slowly, her hand grazing the wall just enough to maintain balance without making noise. At the bottom, the space opened up, not large, but structured, organized. This wasn't a storage basement, it was a controlled environment. Equipment lined the walls, some recognizable, some not. Cages, but not the kind used for housing, more like containment. Screens mounted in a row, currently dark. And in the center of the room, an empty table lit by a single overhead light. Elena stepped forward, her eyes moving quickly, taking in every detail. This was it, the core of it, the place where the surface operation ended and the real one began. She moved toward the nearest console, her fingers hovering just above the controls. And then, "You made it." The voice came from behind her, calm, measured, familiar. Elena didn't turn immediately. She didn't react at all. Because this was the moment everything shifted. Slowly, she turned. And the figure standing at the base of the stairs wasn't the director. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't someone she expected to confront directly. It was the staff member. The one who had handed her the note. the one who had warned her, the one she had just begun to consider an ally. "You're early," the woman said, stepping forward into the light. Her expression was different now. Not afraid, not hesitant, controlled. "Midnight was the invitation," Elena replied evenly. "Not the limit." The woman's lips curved slightly. "Good. That means you're thinking." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "You set this up." It wasn't a question. "Of course I did," the woman said. No hesitation, no denial, just confirmation. That was the twist. Not hidden, not delayed. Delivered clean. The warning had been real, but not for the reason Elena initially thought. It wasn't about protecting her. It was about guiding her, steering her into position. "You wanted me here," Elena said. "Yes." "Why?" The woman took another step closer, her posture relaxed but deliberate. "Because you're already involved. Because you saw what you weren't supposed to see. And because you didn't walk away." She tilted her head slightly. "People like that are useful." There it was. Not an enemy in the traditional sense. Not an ally either. Something in between. Someone operating within the system but not entirely bound by it. "You work for them," Elena said. "I work within the structure," the woman corrected. "There's a difference." Elena let that sit for a moment. "And what do you want from me?" "To see how far you're willing to go." The answer was immediate, honest in a way that made it more dangerous. "This place," the woman continued, gesturing around them, "isn't just a shelter. You figured that out. But what you haven't seen yet is the scale." She reached toward one of the consoles, pressing a sequence of buttons. The screens flickered to life. What appeared wasn't just data, it was a network. Multiple locations, multiple operations, not just animals, training programs, behavioral conditioning, deployment logs. Elena's jaw tightened, but her expression didn't change. "You're building something," she said quietly. "We're refining something," the woman corrected again. "The potential was always there. We're just accelerating it." The implication was clear. This wasn't about the pups alone. They were part of a larger system. A system that extended far beyond this building. "And the director?" Elena asked. "A piece," the woman said. "Important, but not the top." That confirmed the deeper conspiracy. The real enemy wasn't a single person. It was a structure, a network. And now Elena was standing inside it. "So what is this?" she asked. "A recruitment?" The woman smiled slightly. "A test." Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Elena nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Then let's be clear," she said. "You brought me here to see if I'd panic, if I'd run, if I'd try to shut this down without understanding it." The woman's eyes sharpened. "And?" Elena took a step forward, closing part of the distance between them. "And I'm still here." That was her counterplay. Not resistance, not compliance, control. Because in that moment she wasn't reacting to the twist. She was absorbing it, using it. The woman studied her for a long second. Then she nodded slowly. "Good." But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't see, was that Elena had already made her move long before stepping into that basement. Every step, every signal, every piece of data she had gathered had been transmitted, encrypted, and secured. This wasn't just infiltration anymore. It was exposure in progress. And now, with the full scope of the operation laid out in front of her, Elena wasn't just playing their game. She was setting the end of it in motion. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, precise. The kind that exists when two sides realize they're no longer testing each other, but closing in on an endgame. Elena stood in the center of the basement, the glow of the screens reflecting faintly in her eyes, her posture unchanged. but her focus sharper than it had ever been. Across from her, the woman who had orchestrated the meeting watched carefully, not with arrogance, but with measured curiosity, as if trying to determine whether the person in front of her was an asset or a threat that had just fully revealed itself. Neither of them moved for a few seconds, but everything was already in motion. Because what the woman didn't know, what no one in that building fully understood yet, was that the moment Elena stepped into the basement, the operation had already begun to collapse. Not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely, piece by piece, like a structure whose foundation had been quietly removed. "You're calm," the woman said finally, her voice low, observant rather than confrontational. "Most people wouldn't be." "Most people weren't invited," Elena replied, her tone steady, almost conversational, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. A faint smile touched the woman's lips. "That's one way to look at it." "No," Elena said, her gaze locking onto hers, unblinking now. "It's the accurate way to look at it." That was the shift, subtle but irreversible. Up until that moment, the interaction had carried the illusion of balance, two individuals navigating a shared space of uncertainty. But now, the dynamic had changed. The woman noticed it. Of course she did. People like her always notice shifts in control, even when they can't immediately explain them. "What are you really here for?" she asked, her tone tightening just slightly. Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the console, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge, not interacting with it, just grounding herself in the space. "You think this is a test?" she said after a moment. "You think you brought me here to see how I'd react, but that's not what this is." The woman's expression hardened a fraction. "Then explain it." Elena turned her head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes again. "This is the part where you realize you've been observed longer than you thought." For the first time since the conversation began, there was a break in the woman's composure. Not panic, not fear, but recognition. The kind that comes when a variable you thought you controlled turns out to be independent. "That's not possible," she said, but the certainty in her voice had thinned. "It is," Elena replied calmly, "and it already happened." At that exact moment, something changed in the room, not physically, but perceptibly. A faint vibration, almost too subtle to notice unless you were paying attention. The screens flickered. Not off. Not broken. Interrupted. The woman's eyes snapped to the nearest monitor. "What did you do?" Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I didn't do anything just now," she said. "That was set in motion hours ago." The flicker became a disruption. Data streams lagged. Feeds stuttered. And then, one by one, the screens began to display something new. Not internal logs. Not system diagnostics. External access. Secure channels breached. Encrypted files transferring. "No," the woman said sharply, stepping toward the console, her hands moving quickly over the controls. "No, no, no. This system is isolated." "It was," Elena said, "before you opened it for me." That was the final realization, the invitation, the access. And the controlled environment she thought she was managing had become the entry point Elena needed. Not to gather evidence, that part had already been done, but to trigger exposure. "You used me," the woman said, her voice no longer controlled but not yet frantic. Something in between. "I let you think you were using me," Elena corrected. Footsteps echoed faintly from above. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Coordinated. More than one set. The sound of doors opening. Voices. Distant, but authoritative. The woman heard it too. Her head snapped toward the stairwell, then back to Elena. "You don't understand what you've just done." Elena's expression didn't change. "I understand exactly what I've done." "This isn't just one facility," the woman pressed. stepping closer now, her voice low, urgent. You saw the network. You saw how deep this goes. Shutting this down here doesn't stop it. It destabilizes it. And when systems like this destabilize, they collapse, Elena said. They adapt, the woman shot back. And when they do, they become harder to find, harder to control. You just made this worse. Elena held her gaze, unshaken. No, she said quietly. I made it visible. The footsteps above grew louder now, closer. Commands being issued, not shouted, but firm, precise. This wasn't a random intervention. It was coordinated enforcement, the kind that only moves when the evidence is undeniable. The woman looked at her again, something shifting behind her eyes. Not just frustration now, something more complex. You think this ends with arrests? She asked. You think exposing one branch of this changes anything? It's not one branch, Elena said. It's a starting point. Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't controlled. It was fractured. The door at the top of the stairs opened. Light spilled into the stairwell, cutting through the dimness of the basement. Shadows moved, multiple figures, descending with purpose, not hesitation. The sound of boots on concrete, equipment, voices confirming positions. The woman didn't run. That was the fifth thing that set her apart. She stood where she was, her shoulders straightening, her expression settling back into something composed, not calm, not relaxed, but resolved. They'll take this place, she said, her voice quieter now. They'll shut it down, but they won't understand it. Elena didn't respond immediately, because part of that was true. Understanding systems like this doesn't happen in a single moment, and it takes time, layers, context. But stopping them? That starts somewhere. It's enough, Elena said finally. The first of the officials reached the bottom of the stairs, weapons lowered but ready, eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They moved with certainty. Elena, one of them said, his voice cutting through the tension. She turned her head slightly. Over here. They moved in, securing the area, isolating the woman without aggression, but without giving her space to maneuver. She didn't resist. As they began to take control of the room, Elena stepped back, giving them space, her role in this phase complete. But her attention shifted, not to the people, to the sound beneath it all, a faint scratching, soft, uneven, coming from one of the containment units along the far wall. She moved toward it instinctively, her steps slower now, more careful. As she approached, she saw it, the smallest of the pups, curled in the corner of the enclosure, its body tense, its eyes wide but fixed on her. Not on the others, on her. Recognition. She crouched down slowly, her movements gentle now, completely different from the precision of moments before. Hey, she said softly. The pup didn't retreat. It shifted slightly, just enough to close the distance between them. Behind her, the room was filling with activity. Orders, confirmations, systems being shut down. But in that moment, it felt distant. Muted. She reached out carefully, her hand stopping just short of contact, giving the animal space to decide. A second passed. Then the pup leaned forward, if pressing lightly against her fingers. Trust. Not trained. Not conditioned. Chosen. Elena exhaled slowly, something in her posture finally easing for the first time since she stepped into this entire situation. You're okay, she murmured. It's over. Whether that was entirely true yet didn't matter. It was true enough. She lifted the pup gently, holding it close, its small body still tense at first, then gradually relaxing against her. One of the officers approached. We've secured the upper levels. More units are on the way. Elena nodded once. There are others, she said. Down here. And records. Everything's been accessed. You'll have what you need. He followed her gaze, then gave a short, understanding nod before moving off to coordinate. Elena stayed where she was for a moment longer, the pup still in her arms, and its breathing steadying, its weight settling. The chaos around them continued, but it no longer felt like tension. It felt like resolution in motion. After a while, she stood, carrying the pup with her as she moved toward the stairs. Each step upward felt different from the descent. Lighter. Not because the situation was simple now, but because the direction had changed. At the top, the night air hit her again, cool and clear. The building behind her was no longer just a structure hiding something. It was a place being uncovered. She walked a few steps away before stopping, looking down at the pup in her arms. It looked back at her, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, just present, alive, safe, for now. She let that moment settle. Then she looked up, her gaze shifting outward, beyond the building, to beyond the immediate aftermath. Because the woman had been right about one thing. This didn't end here. It started here. And as the lights of arriving vehicles flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the ground, Elena asked the question that lingered beneath everything that had happened, one that didn't have a simple answer, one that reached beyond this single story. When something hidden is finally brought into the light, do you stop at what you've exposed? Or do you keep going, knowing how much more might still be out there? The sirens didn't arrive all at once. They built slowly, layering over the night like a rising tide, first distant, then undeniable. Blue and red lights began to spill across the front of the shelter, cutting through the darkness in sharp, pulsing streaks. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like the end of something. The kind of moment people point to later and say, that's when it was stopped. But Elena knew better. Endings don't usually feel this quiet on the inside. They feel incomplete, open, like something unresolved is still moving beneath the surface. She stood just beyond the perimeter, the small pup still resting in her arms, its body now fully relaxed against her chest. The tremble that had once run through it was gone, replaced with a steady, fragile calm. Its breathing matched hers, slow and even, as if it had already decided, on instinct alone, that she was safe. That trust should have felt like relief. It should have felt like closure. But instead, it created a different kind of tension in her chest. Not fear, not doubt. Something sharper. Something that hadn't been there before. Because something didn't add up. Not in the obvious way. Not in the structure of the operation or the behavior of the people involved. Those pieces had fallen into place. The network, the system, the exposure. It all aligned. Too well. And that was the problem. Elena shifted her weight slightly, her gaze drifting back toward the building. Officers moved in coordinated patterns, securing entrances, escorting individuals out, cataloging evidence. The woman from the basement had already been taken into custody, her expression unreadable even as she was led away. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't said anything else. Not to Elena, not to anyone. That alone was unusual. People like her, the ones who operate inside systems, who understand power structures and manipulation, they don't go quietly unless they believe the game isn't over. And she had looked at Elena one last time before being taken upstairs. Not with anger, not even with defeat, with certainty. That was the sixth thing that didn't sit right. Elena exhaled slowly, her fingers adjusting slightly against the pup's back. It shifted in response, pressing closer, its small head tucking just beneath her chin. She closed her eyes for half a second, grounding herself in the physical reality of the moment, the weight, the warmth. the steady heartbeat. Real. Unquestionably real, which made everything else harder to ignore. "Everything okay?" a voice called from behind her. She turned slightly. One of the officers, same one from earlier, was approaching, his expression professional but not distant. He had the look of someone who had seen operations like this before, but not exactly like this. "For now," she said. He nodded, glancing briefly at the pup. "We've got teams sweeping the entire facility. Upper levels are clear. Basements secured. Digital units are already pulling data from the system you accessed." Elena watched him for a moment. And? "And it's big," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "Bigger than we thought. Multiple locations. Cross-referenced identifiers. This wasn't just an isolated operation." "I know," she replied. He studied her for a second, as if trying to decide how much to say next. "There's something else," he added. "We're seeing repeated markers in the data, behavioral tags, neural response logs. It's advanced." Elena didn't react outwardly, but something inside her tightened. "How advanced?" He hesitated. "Enough that our analysts are already flagging it for higher-level review. This isn't just training, it's something closer to integration." That word landed heavier than the rest. Integration, not conditioning, not influence, something deeper. "Keep me updated," she said. He nodded. "Of course." Then, after a brief pause, "You did good tonight." Elena didn't respond to that. Not because she disagreed, but because it wasn't the point. Not anymore. As he walked away, her attention shifted again. This time not to the building, not to the officers, but to something much closer. The pup. It had gone still again. Not tense, not afraid. Still. Its body no longer adjusting to her movements, no longer reacting to external noise. Just still. She frowned slightly, lowering her gaze. "Hey," she murmured softly. No response. Its eyes were open, but not in the same way as before. Not tracking, not focusing. Not observing. A subtle difference. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Elena was. Her fingers moved gently along its back, testing for tension, for resistance. There was none. Its muscles were relaxed, its breathing steady, but something about its stillness felt deliberate. And then it happened. Small, almost imperceptible. The pup's ear twitched, not in response to sound, but in rhythm. Once, pause, twice, pause, 3 times, a pattern. Elena's breath slowed. That wasn't random. Her mind moved quickly now, connecting pieces that had been scattered until this moment. The coordination she had seen earlier, the awareness, the way they had responded, not just to stimuli, but to presence. She shifted her grip slightly, turning just enough to block the pup from direct view of the others around her. Her thumb brushed lightly along the faint marking near its eye, the same one she had noticed the first time she saw it. And beneath the fur, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was something else. A line. Too straight. Too precise. Not natural. Her pulse didn't spike. It didn't need to. The realization settled in with cold clarity. This one wasn't just part of the system. It was still connected to it. Not physically. Not in any obvious, detectable way, but functionally. She looked up again, scanning the area, not for threats, not for movement, but for patterns, signals, devices, anything that could be receiving or transmitting. Nothing obvious, which meant it wasn't obvious by design. The officer's words echoed in her mind. Integration. Her grip on the pup tightened slightly, not enough to alarm it, but enough to ground herself again. Because now the question wasn't what had been exposed, it was what hadn't. She turned slowly, stepping further away from the main activity, moving toward the edge of the perimeter where the lights didn't reach as strongly. The noise faded slightly, giving her just enough space to think without interruption. The pup's ear twitched again. Same pattern. Not random. Not reflex. Signal. Elena's jaw tightened just slightly. They hadn't lost everything tonight. They had lost a facility. A node. But the system itself? It was still active. And it was still communicating. Through something no one else would think to check. Something small. Something overlooked. Something everyone assumed was just a survivor. She looked down at it again, her expression unreadable now, but her thoughts sharper than ever. "You're not just a victim, are you?" she murmured under her breath. The pup didn't respond. Not in any way that would be obvious to anyone else, but its breathing shifted. Just slightly. Enough. Elena exhaled slowly, her mind already moving ahead, recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the operation, about the exposure, about the outcome. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was a controlled loss, a sacrifice. And she had just carried the most important piece of it out herself. Her gaze lifted again, scanning the scene one more time, not as someone who had completed a mission, but as someone who had just uncovered a deeper layer of it. The officers, the vehicles, the secured building. All of it still mattered, but not in the way they thought. And because while they were shutting down what they could see, something else had already moved beyond their reach. And now, it was in her arms. She adjusted her hold on the pup, her expression settling into something quieter, more focused. Not fear, not hesitation. Resolve. Because the real decision hadn't been made yet. Not by the system, not by the people chasing it, but by her. What do you do when the thing you fought to save might be the very thing that keeps the danger alive?